Good morning. I would like to welcome all of you who have logged in to our investor call, in which we will review the recent research note we published, Genetic Medicine's 2022 Year in Review and Expectations for 2023. My name is Keay. I'm one of the senior biotech analysts here at Chardan. Joining me on this call are my Chardan colleagues and fellow senior biotech analysts, Drs. Geulah, Livshits, Daniil, Gataulin. As call participants are familiar, our focus at Chardan is on identifying companies that can generate exceptionally high long-term investment returns by creating shared value for society through disruptive innovation. Before we get started, just a compliance issue. During this call, we will be discussing our published notes that contain all the relevant compliance disclosures. With that said, for anyone in our audience who'd like to submit a question, please type it into the chat box. We have allotted some time later in the call to answer questions. So let's get started. On the plus side, 2022 once again saw significant scientific platform development and clinical validation advancements achieved by genetic medicines-focused companies, which we believe should continue into 2023. Despite that, 2022 proved to be a challenging year for biotech stocks, and particularly those in the genetic medicine sector. The MBI was a tale of two halves, declining 29% from the start of the year to the June low in the markets, then basically trended upward to finish the full year down 11%, outperforming the S&P 500, which declined by 19%. Another biotech index, the modified equal weighted XBI, declined by 26%. Digging deeper, 2022 proved to be a challenging year for pre and early clinical stage small and microcap companies in the genetic medicine sector, as access to additional capital became significantly more expensive. Strategic realignments involving pipeline reprioritization and headcount reductions required to extend operating runway with existing capital were a common occurrence. A frequently expressed comment we heard from company management at JPM meetings last month, for those fortunate to be in this position, was relief that they did not have to raise cash in 2023. That said, we believe that the resulting reset in valuations in the sector has created more attractive entry points for selective biotech investors. We believe a number of fundamentals remain strong, with continued discovery, development, and clinical validation, a pace with large pharma cash positions supportive of M&A and collaborations, position the sector for a stronger performance in 2023. The first month of 2023 is off to a better start, with the XBI up 8% year to date. Let me now hand the mic over to Geulah to first discuss the review and outlook for gene editing and for cell therapy.
Thanks, Kay. So in 2022, although the gene editing space saw a pullback from 2021 highs, which was a decline of about 50% over the year for the basket of public genome editing companies that we track, the space did continue to move forward, both in terms of regulatory and clinical progress across ex vivo and in vivo modalities, and in terms of the science around next-gen strategies. So on the in vivo gene editing front, in 2022, we had additional waves of data from Intellia's liver-directed lipid nanoparticle editing programs for transthyretin amyloidosis and hereditary angioedema. And we continue to be impressed by the translatability of lipid nanoparticle editing in the liver, from mice to non-human primates to humans. So Intellia will have some additional data on those programs this year, but is also planning on bringing its liver-directed insertion program into the clinic in the second half of the year for lung manifestations of alpha-1 antitrypsin. And that program incorporates an AAV vector to deliver the DNA template. So there is an additional technology risk component, since we've seen a spectrum of AAV translatability, at least for gene delivery. But also on the in vivo front, 2022 was the year that in vivo base editing entered the clinic with Verve's PCSK9 editing program. I don't cover Verve, so I won't speak to valuation or commercial points, but from a scientific standpoint, that was a landmark. And in 2023, we can look forward to two things. One is the initial clinical data on in vivo base editing, and we'll see if the translatability that we saw in Intellia's programs will hold for base editing as well. And then the second thing that we expect to see is these in vivo systemic editing programs achieve IND clearance and start trials in the US. Thus far, they've been in New Zealand and or Europe. Providing evidence that these types of programs can get into alignment with US regulators will be another important milestone for that space. On the regulatory front, CRISPR Therapeutics and Vertex had the milestone of the first regulatory submissions for a CRISPR therapy for their gene-edited hematopoietic stem cell therapy program XSL for sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia when they submitted MAAs at the end of 2022. This year, we could see regulatory decisions in the landmark first commercial CRISPR therapy, about 10 years after the initial papers describing CRISPR editing in human cells. And so now engineered cell therapies has been a challenging space in terms of commercialization. We've seen companies like Bluebird Bio and Orchard struggle despite reaching regulatory approvals. So our view on XSL has been that with Vertex leading their global footprint and commercial expertise, they'd be in a pretty good position to build out the necessary infrastructure and payer agreements to make this work, at least in the US and Europe. And we think all of this will have implications for other engineered cell therapy programs, including Rocket's Fanconi anemia and leukocyte adhesion deficiency gene therapy programs, which are on track for a BLA filing this year, and other hemoglobinopathy assets as well, like Bluebird's Lenti programs, as well as other follower gene editing programs from Editas and Beam, each of which are aiming to be best in class if they're able to show some differentiation from XSL. And they could leverage a lot of the groundwork and education that will be built out for XSL over the next few years. We think that the market share there will depend to some extent on how much differentiation there is. And that's something that we may not have a good handle on this year, but should begin to get a sense of as Editas accumulates a larger data set and Beam starts reporting out data in 2024. But we'll also be closely watching strategies that each of these companies have started talking about with respect to expanding target populations for ex vivo therapeutics in terms of gentler conditioning regimens, as well as in vivo hematopoietic cell and stem cell engineering, which we see as part of the overall in vivo immune cell engineering theme that we flagged as being interesting for investors with a long horizon.
So Geulah, let me ask you a question. What do you view as the key advances with next-gen gene editing companies and technologies?
Yeah, so the other area that we're closely following in the genome editing space with a long-term view is the next-gen nuclease technologies that include new CRISPR enzymes, as well as next-gen precision editing functionalities that could allow for gene writing or insertion without the necessity of a double-strand break. We've seen some scientific as well as biotech activity in that space in 2022 with Prime completing an IPO. And we're now seeing private companies like Arbor, Elevate, Mammoth, Metagenome, and Scribe start to really carve out pipelines and discuss programs in a bit more detail. Last year, we said we expect to see partnering activity with those companies continue, and that's certainly been playing out. But then beyond the enzymes themselves, we're really continuing to closely follow the gene writing approaches that allow for larger insertions without needing the double strand breaks by companies like Tome, Tessera, Prime, and others. These type of approaches could enable precise permanent gene correction for diseases that are characterized by multiple mutations across the gene rather than a single mutation or a set of hotspot mutations. And as I understand it, prime editing itself is still about a year away from the clinic or more, and these are less mature. So understanding how the efficiency and specificity optimizations are progressing will be really important to understand where these types of approaches will present an incremental advance over other technologies from a benefit risk standpoint. So more generally in the cell therapy space, when we think about oncology, 2022 was an interesting year for cell therapies. Autologous CAR Ts have started to pick up some more commercial momentum as CD19 CAR Ts have entered the market in earlier lines in different types of B-cell cancers, while BCMA CAR Ts such as Abecma and Carvykti saw some considerable demand in multiple myeloma and in the commercial setting, and are also in studies to move into earlier lines there. So that's also on the backdrop of bispecifics showing pretty respectable results in lymphoma and multiple myeloma as an off-the-shelf option. So where does that leave us for 2023? Well, we now have therapies that are getting closer to commercialization for solid tumors on the cell therapy front. So that would be Adaptimmune's afami-cel for synovial sarcoma and Iovance's lifileucel, though the latter isn't a genetic medicine. It is relevant for the broader cell therapy space. And those BLAs are expected to be completed by the middle of the year for afami-cel and the first quarter for lifileucel. So we could see landmark regulatory decisions on those this year. It's been a long road for cell therapy in the solid tumor space, so that will have read across for other companies that are operating in the space like Immatics. The 2024 will probably be a better indicator of what the commercial uptake and the logistics there look like, and whether they can learn from the challenges that the first wave of CAR T programs for hematopoietic cancers faced in 2017, 2018, et cetera, to more effectively reach their patients. But for allogeneic cell therapies, and that includes edited CAR Ts, NK cells, gamma delta cells, and the like, the durability of effect really remains an open question as companies assess the benefit risk of different engineering constructs, cell types, and dosing regimens. Allogene is moving forward with a one-time dose in a pivotal study using their CD52 antibody as part of the conditioning regimen for CD19 program. CRISPR Therapeutics is starting a potentially registrational trial of its CD19 CAR T using a consolidation dosing, and Caribou is doing dose escalation and will have some data in 2023. NK cell companies such as Fate, Centurion, and Carta are evaluating things like 3-dose regimens and in some cases multiple cycles. But the open question is really what kind of immune evasion engineering and whether, for example, beta-2 microglobulin disruption, HLA-E overexpression, HLA-G overexpression, CD47 overexpression, and other strategies. What kind of immune evasion approach is needed and whether that's going to be the same for different cell types and different tumor types. Again, most of what we know we're learning from CD19 or BCMA. From our perspective, we think the areas where cell therapies and allo approaches in particular can improve over biologics is in their engineerability, where you can incorporate multiple functional elements without necessarily the same structural constraints as you might have with a bispecific format. And I think this can become advantageous as you get into more challenging tumors where the microenvironment presents a barrier. But I understand the desire to start with a known target to benchmark the technology. Now, we're starting to see some next-gen programs go into the clinic. For example, Fate has reworked its pipeline. CRISPR has added next-gen assets to its pipeline. Sana and Century have programs entering the clinic now. So we're not counting allo cell therapies out. There is work to be done from the science standpoint, and over 2023 and 2024, we expect to learn more, and we expect companies to be thoughtful about data disclosure here. But coming back to what I was saying earlier, longer term, we're also very closely following the in vivo cell therapy space, where companies like Capstan, Orna, Charisma, and Myeloid are aiming to engineer tumor killing cells in vivo. That's probably more of a 5-year time horizon to understand the key issues there with respect to construct design, optimal dosing, optimal applications. But I see that as kind of an interesting space somewhere between cell therapy and bispecifics. Outside oncology, we're also seeing momentum for gene delivery to the heart and lung. We've been seeing a lot of programs in the genetic cardiomyopathy space nearing the clinic, building off of Rocket's progress with their AAV9 program for Danin. Tenaya received IND clearance for the MYBPC3 hypertrophic cardiomyopathy program, and they plan to file an IND for their PKP2 gene therapy program for ARVC later this year. Rocket is planning an IND filing for their own recently announced PKP2 gene therapy in the second quarter. Lexeo is planning a 2023 filing, as is Stride Bio. These programs use different AAV vectors, so there's potential to see some differentiation, which will be interesting. The other area where we're seeing some clustering of activity is lung, in particular in cystic fibrosis. There certainly have been efforts here in the past, most notably Translate Bio's mRNA lung program that did not lead to increases in FEV, but we're now seeing a few different modalities, including a 40 Molecular Therapeutics AAV program, which is now in the clinic, an AAV program from Spearvant, parvovirus programs from Carbon Biosciences, which are preclinical. Crystal is now screening patients for their HSV gene therapy program, and Vertex and Moderna are now in the clinic with Moderna's mRNA platform for cystic fibrosis. Recode is planning an IND filing in cystic fibrosis later this year, and Recode and Prime both have earlier stage gene editing approaches in their pipelines. So there's lots of shots on goal there to break into the 10% of cystic fibrosis patients not addressable by modulator drugs and non-responders, and more generally to get into the lung. We'll be obviously closely looking at safety, durability, and of the effect, and also things like dosing frequency. We think it'll be interesting both because of cystic fibrosis and as the potential for other lung diseases and perhaps eventually vaccines as well. Maybe I'll pause there and ask Daniil, what kind of trends have you been seeing in the ophthalmology space?
Yeah, thank you, Geulah. So ophthalmology space looks to be pretty active in 2023, with multiple companies continuing to make progress with gene therapies in wet AMD, diabetic retinopathy, and diabetic macular edema, retinitis pigmentosa, including several optogenetic approaches, as well as other indications. In terms of regulatory approval decisions in ophthalmology, GenSight is awaiting the decision from the EMA for its gene therapy Lumiloc in Leber hereditary optic neuropathy in the third quarter of this year. and with the potential launch by the end of the year. As you know, there are a number of approved anti-VEGF options available to patients with wet AMD, diabetic retinopathy, and diabetic macular edema, but they still require regular injections and represent a high treatment burden for the patients. So companies developing single administration gene therapies in these indications include REGENXBIO, who is developing RGX-314. It's a pivotal stage intravitreal gene therapy asset for wet AMD, with the BLA submission expected in 2024. RGX-314 is also in a phase 2 study for suprachoroidal delivery in wet AMD, as well as phase 2 study in diabetic retinopathy. Anvirum is developing ADVM-022, which is now in a phase 2 study in wet AMD, with data readouts expected throughout 2023. 4D Molecular Therapeutics just initiated a phase 2 study of 4D 150 in wet AMD last month and plans to initiate another phase 2 study in diabetic macular edema in third quarter of 2023. Another company, Exogenesis Bio, expects to initiate a phase 1 wet AMD study of EXG102-031 this quarter. In other ocular indications, Mira has 4 gene therapy clinical programs in inherited retinal diseases, including a phase 3 trial of AAV5-RPGR, a program for X-linked retinitis pigmentosa that is being developed in partnership with Janssen, and the companies are targeting 2024 for BLA submission. Ocugen has continued to advance its modifier gene therapy pipeline across a range of genetically diverse inherited retinal diseases, including a phase 1/2 study of a split candidate OCU400 targeting NR2E3 and RHO for retinitis pigmentosa and Leber congenital amaurosis, with initial data expected in mid-2023. Ocugen also has plans to submit INDs in dry AMD and in Stargardt disease in the second quarter of this year. 4D Molecular Therapeutics has completed enrollment in phase 1/2 trials in X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. That's a program 4D-125, and choroideremia, which is the program 4D-110 in the first quarter last year. And the company expects to provide program and clinical updates in 2024. It also expanded its portfolio to include preclinical assets, 4D-175 for geographic atrophy. So as you can see, there are quite a few gene therapy programs in development in ophthalmology, and 2023 is shaping up to be a fairly busy year in terms of catalysts.
Great. And so, Matt, maybe I'll direct this next question to you. I talked about some of the issues relating to commercialization for cell therapies. One of the companies you cover, Unicure, recently had an approval. So what were your takeaways on that regarding pricing and potential for marketability and any general implications for the broader space?
Excellent question. So in 2022, we saw a string of approvals of gene therapy within the gene therapy space that support the one-and-done drug class, providing long-lasting treatments or even cures for multiple diseases. And along with these novel gene therapy approvals in 2022, the conversation on drug pricing returned to the spotlight with some astonishing prices, to say the least. So Bluebird's Integlo for beta thalassemia is priced at $2.8 million for the therapy, and Skysona, Bluebird's adrenoleukodystrophy drug, is priced at $3 million per treatment. Then we saw Hemgenix from Unicure and CSL take the cake with the most expensive gene therapy ever at $3.5 million for the treatment. Now, understandably, these prices are hard to imagine, but consider that the lifetime costs of hemophilia B management can run upwards on the order of $20 million per patient. So the overall savings on the healthcare system with these gene therapies can be significant. And for the moment, we're also talking about rare diseases where there are not that many patients to begin with, and even fewer that may be eligible for treatment. So the overall cost burden of these gene therapies is minimized on the grand scale for most payers. However, some unknowns for these therapies, particularly related to the duration of benefit, will need to be worked out. There's likely to be some experimentation with payer contracts, such as value-based agreements, that may be necessary along the way.
Great. Maybe now I'll pass it back to Keay to discuss the RNA space.
Yeah, thanks, Geulah. We believe that small RNA therapeutics are poised for continued success in 2023, with programs exploiting the established playbook for success, i.e., pursuing validated targets, functional deployment of oligonucleotide chemistries, and effective delivery, progressing through clinical trials. Let me highlight a few items. The highest profile data readout in the RNA space in 2022 was the positive result from Alnylam's Apollo B phase 3 study of patisiran in patients with ATTR amyloidosis with cardiomyopathy. The trial achieved its primary endpoint of statistically significant improvement in the 6-minute walk test in patients receiving patisiran versus placebo. Based on Apollo B's results, Alnylam submitted a supplemental NDA to the FDA in December to expand Onpattro's label to include cardiomyopathy beyond the currently labeled polyneuropathy patients, with an approval decision expected in the second half of 23. From a commercial standpoint, we note that the label expansion to ATTR-CM will significantly add to the company's revenue stream, with the addressable patient population for cardiomyopathy estimated to be several times larger than that for poly, in which the company generated over $650 million in revenue in 2022. Alnylam was one of the best performing stocks in 2022, up 40%. Another notable RNAi clinical achievement in 2022 was the data readouts from competing siRNA programs based on targeting elevated lipoprotein A, or Lp(a), which is an independent risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, from both Amgen and Silence Therapeutics. Amgen's asset, olpasiran, is a GalNAc-based siRNA therapeutic that was originally developed by Arrowhead and licensed to Amgen in 2016. Silence's asset, SLN360, is also a GalNAc siRNA construct. Olpasiran is further along in the clinic and has now been advanced into a phase 3 cardiovascular outcome study following the positive phase 2 data readout in 2022, showing robust Lp(a) reduction of greater than 95%. Silence presented encouraging proof of concept results at the 22 ACC meeting from its phase 1 single ascending dose study of SLN360 in healthy adults with high Lpa levels. The study was also simultaneously published in JAMA. SLN360 has now been advanced into a phase 2 study. Sticking with cardiometabolic programs, we saw encouraging phase 2 data from Arrowhead's ApoC3 targeting severe hypertriglyceridemia and mixed dyslipidemia, and ANG3 targeting familial hypercholesterolemia at AHA in November. These initial results increase our optimism of positive full trial data from these programs to be reported later this year, and the advancement of these programs into phase 3 trials. New conjugates that enable small RNA delivery beyond the liver advanced into the clinic in 2022, with initial results providing proof of concept for targeting the transferrin receptor on muscle cells. Here, the most important data was the initial first-in-human clinical data reported in December by Avidity for AOC 1001, showing knockdown of DMPK mRNA and splicing improvement in DM1 patients. The data provided a general proof of concept for Avidity's AOC platform, which utilizes a conjugated full monoclonal antibody for targeted delivery. It demonstrated successful delivery and uptake of siRNA to skeletal muscle, endosomal escape and migration of the siRNA into the nucleus, and successful engagement of the siRNA with a RISC complex in the nucleus to achieve target mRNA silencing. In 2023, Avidity will report additional clinical data for DM1 and initial clinical data for its AOC 1044 candidate targeting DMD. Closely related Dyne is expected to report its initial clinical data in the second half of 23 for Dyne 251, its candidate targeting DMD patients, and Dyne 101, its candidate for targeting DM1. Other programs with targets outside the liver that we will be following closely in 23 include Arrowhead's 3 siRNA programs targeting the lung, which are currently in phase 1/2A clinical trials, with initial safety readouts in the first half of 23, and also Alnylam's ALN-APP, which utilizes its C16 lipophilic conjugate, which will shortly report data from a phase 1 study in Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, what read across do you see, if any, from Avidity's first-in-human data to those other programs?
Yeah, I think that the key read across is the validation of the transferrin receptor for muscle. It seems to have sufficient expression and sufficient turnover to be able to allow for uptake of sufficient drug to have an effect. I think what we need to appreciate is that there are a number of different approaches in how to do that. Again, Dyne and Avidity using an antibody as the targeting or navigation component of their drugs. Their payloads are different though. Avidity using an siRNA for DM1, Dyne using an ASO. And then as we look at other diseases such as DMD, both are using a PMO. But I would say it's really the validation of the transferrin receptor. So let me also touch on ADAR RNA editing, which continues to be of interest to big pharma. Late in the year, we saw a new investment by GSK in Wave Life Sciences, giving them $170 million upfront to license their lead ADAR asset, Wave 006, targeting AATD. Wave is currently conducting IND-enabling studies for 006 with the goal of filing CTAs in 2023. Also in December, we saw Eli Lilly expand its licensing and research collaboration with ProQR for its proprietary Axiomer ADAR editing platform, providing another $75 million upfront. And separately, we would note that a Series B1 raise of $46 million by ADAR X Pharma occurred in January of 2023. And then finally, we continue to follow the development programs that are in a preclinical stage for those targeting both long non-coding RNA and those looking to utilize circular RNA as a payload. Maybe to wrap up RNA, Geulah, let me ask you to give a few quick thoughts on mRNA.
Yeah, so for mRNA, the major developments in recent months were the rollout of Omicron-specific boosters, as well as proof of concept efficacy and indications outside of COVID, including Moderna's personalized cancer vaccine with Merck and its RSV efficacy data. Going forward, we're interested in seeing where the cancer vaccine space goes in terms of the specifics and the path there, and also data on flu vaccine and combination vaccines. The combination vaccines using the mRNA modality could really differentiate from protein-based vaccines from our perspective. And then we're also looking closely at inhaled or intranasal vaccine approaches, which I flagged as being maybe interesting back in 2020 as a way to induce better mucosal immunity and reduce transmission of COVID, as well as perhaps maybe other respiratory pathogens. But it's early days here, but we continue to wonder if that's a direction where the field might go. It comes back to the interest that I'd mentioned earlier regarding genetic medicines in the airways.
Okay, well, great. Well, at this point, why don't we move on to some questions from the audience. The first question, could you tell us which are your high conviction names in your coverage area? So Geulah, why don't you start?
Sure. So in terms of top picks, I have high conviction on a number of companies that are developing interesting platform technologies in the gene editing, gene delivery, and cell therapy spaces. But with the current market environment, I'm focusing a bit more conviction on names with late stage assets or catalysts that really could direct the company towards late stage development paths. So for that second point, I'm highlighting Immatics. It's a clinical stage company that's developing cell therapies as well as TCR-like bispecifics for solid tumors. With clinical dose expansion data on their PRAME-targeted cell therapy program coming this year, and they're bringing their wholly owned PRAME bispecific into the clinic this year as well. They have a runway into 2025 and are based on credible science and antigen presentation expertise and have been steadily executing against their guidance. On the commercial side, we're positive on Crystal Biotech, which has a PDUFA date for their dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa gene therapy in May, and will be dosing other rare skin disease gene therapy programs later this year. They're also advancing a potentially underappreciated aesthetics franchise and just start dosing in cystic fibrosis this year as well. There's other companies that are now advancing HSV gene therapy platforms coming out of, for example, Replay's model. But Crystal has been through the clinical development process and has optimized manufacturing logistics, which are capabilities that shouldn't be underestimated. On the late stage and catalyst side, we're highlighting Rocket. As I mentioned, they're guiding to regulatory filings this year for their 2 lenti ex vivo gene therapy programs and could end the year as a commercial stage company. They're also advancing their cardiac Danon disease gene therapy into a pivotal study this year and are bringing their next cardiac gene therapy for PKP2 into the clinic with IND filing in the next quarter. And while there have been some regulatory setbacks like a clinical hold in Danon, we like how they've executed and worked to reach alignment with regulatory agencies. They have a runway through 2024, but also have a rare pediatric disease designation for their 2 lenti programs, so they could get more cash through PRV sales.
Great, thanks, Geulah. My top pick is Arrowhead. The stock performance of Arrowhead in 2022, frankly, was lousy. It finished the year down 39%. It started off 23 down another 17%. So I guess from our perspective, we think all the bad news is priced in. And for the following reasons, we believe that at the current price, the balance of risk reward is highly favorable for the stock going forward. First, we believe that initial proof of concept clinical data from lung targeting RNAi candidates in 23 could bolster investor confidence in its ability to expand its footprint outside the liver. We believe that the initial safety data to be reported in the first half of 23 is a more important data point than usually ascribed to such data, but we need to consider that the initial lung program from Arrowhead, ENaC, for cystic fibrosis was halted due to tox issues. Second, as previously mentioned, the company has multiple clinical data readouts for its cardiometabolic RNAi candidates, ApoC3 and ANG3 in 2023, which could serve as potential catalysts. As a reminder, these are fully owned programs. They do address large addressable markets and can be partnered as the company sees appropriate. The company has already taken steps to strengthen its cash position. In late 22, it sold its royalty interest in Olpasiran for $250 million upfront. Hence, cash exiting December was $618 million, which is about 2 years of operating cash at the current burn rate. And finally, we believe the stock price belies the company's success in rapidly advancing its pipeline and platform. It does have a broad pipeline that consists of a good mix of preclinical, early stage clinical, and more advanced clinical programs representing multiple ways to win. It currently has 12 clinical stage programs, which is expected to increase to 15 or 16 by the end of this year, with the goal of having 20 individual drug candidates in clinical trials or in the market in 2025. We also have high conviction on Avidity and Dyne, both which will have readouts of initial data from their DMD trials in 2023. And while they are targeting different exons for skipping, we think there's a low bar to show better results than seen thus far from Sarepta's use of a naked PMO. With that, let me pass to Matt.
Yeah, sure. So my top pick for 2023 from within my coverage falls outside the genetic medicine space with a selection of Purple Biotech, which I have a buy rating on and an $11 price target. The company has 2 novel first-in-class immunotherapies for the treatment of cancer, and I find that the updates from each program this year have the opportunity to reignite interest in the name and, importantly, derive value for the programs. Starting the first half of this year, Purple plans to establish a recommended phase 2 dose with their IRS1/2 STAT3 dual inhibitor. You can start the phase 2 portion of their study in the second quarter. And then in the second half of 2023, we look forward to an interim update from the phase 2 trial of their CCAM1 antibody program, CM24, for the treatment of pancreatic cancer, where we should have a look at 6-month PFS rate. The company also recently acquired a preclinical platform for developing trispecific antibodies that could add depth to their company's pipeline in years to come. Daniil?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So my top pick for 2023 also falls outside of the genetic therapy field or genetic medicines field with Outlook Therapeutics with a price target of $10. The company is developing lecanemab, which is an ophthalmic formulation of Avastin for the treatment of wet AMD. The company has submitted the BLA for lecanemab last year, as well as MAA last year, with the PDUFA date of August 29 of this year and the EMA decision expected in early 2024. Letenova is targeting the largest segment of the wet AMD anti-VEGF market. And currently, approximately 50% of wet AMD patients receiving anti-VEGF treatments are prescribed off-label Avastin, with the other 50% divided between the other anti-VEGF therapies. Essentially, all patients receiving Avastin for wet AMD, which is currently distributed by compounding pharmacies, will be available for conversion to Letenova. The company's commercial prep is well underway with strategic commercialization agreement with AmerisourceBergen, and with high awareness regarding Avastin among eye care practitioners. We expect a fairly rapid uptake of Letenova once it's approved. Also, while not a topic, the other program to keep an eye on in 2023 is GenSight with regulatory decision for Lumiwalk in Leber hereditary optic neuropathy from the EMA that is expected in the third quarter of this year. The company had a number of manufacturing setbacks for Lumiwalk that dominated the headlines last year, but these appear to be addressed now, and the company expects to complete validation batches for Lumiwalk by the third quarter of 2023. Back to you, Keay.
Great. Next question. Could you talk about what are the most important advancements in delivery and what to watch out for in 2023? Geulah, why don't you start this one?
Sure. So yeah, delivery is obviously pretty critical for in vivo therapeutics. I think there's kind of two large buckets that I'm interested in, which would be next-gen nanoparticle technologies that could allow for delivery of either mRNAs or circular RNAs or some other genetic medicine type of cargo into tissues beyond the liver. And the second is next-gen viral vectors. So for nanoparticles, I'm very closely following the science regarding targeted approaches, such as the work from Penn that was published early in 2022 and being advanced by Capstan, where they attach targeting moieties to the nanoparticles to target either T cells or some other cell type. Verve also has GalNAc targeted lipid nanoparticles that they're advancing in their pipeline. Code Bio has a non-LNP conjugation technology as well. So there's the targeted approaches that are going to be interesting, as well as some of the approaches that use biophysical properties of lipid nanoparticles or other types of nanoparticles. As for LNPs, or companies like Recode and Orna are moving forward for lung or immune cells. There's other forms of nanoparticles such as nanocrystals. I think those areas are going to be interesting with respect to what the biodistribution look like, and that might dictate what the optimal applications for some of these programs might be. Virus-like particles are also an interesting but early avenue. There's been some work from David Liu's group on that, and Feng Zheng's group on the SEND system using PEG-10. Those are super early kind of publication stage, but could make their way to preclinical studies in the coming year or two. On viral vectors, we'll be interested to see how parameters like identifying the receptor, as Voyager has for its AAV tracer platform, will mean for translatability. Those are some kind of early stage thoughts. Maybe I'll pass it back to you, Keay. What about you?
Yeah, I think for small RNA, I think people appreciate that GalNAc works great, but it's really specific to liver hepatocyte cells, where we're more interested in what allows for delivery outside the liver. We've touched on a couple of these, dyne and avidity, using a conjugated monoclonal antibody, either full or antibody fragment, to target, at least initially, transferrin from muscle. Those can also target other tissue types. We have lipophilic conjugates that Alnylam, they're C16. Dyne has a cholesterol they're using for their targeting. Arrow is using a centurin. It's a small protein which they conjugate onto an oligo payload. They're using an siRNA for their initial program, which is targeting Pompe. So I think that's really what we're looking at there. Let's see, next question. I don't see any more. Okay, so I think with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody for joining us today.